insurance to be sold in their state. They're limiting what can be done. Well, the Congress is not taking their responsibility to regulate commerce by increasing commerce. And Madison, his goal in the Federalist Papers was always to show that the federal government was to limit the actions of states in taxation on goods and services, so that we could always get our potatoes from Idaho and we can get our peaches from Georgia without having to suffer massive taxation. And back then they had cotton, and they had trade of the South was not working with the shippers of the North, and you had a number of issues. So they wanted to make it very smooth, as if you were going to your neighbor's house whenever you bought from Maine, Missouri, Montana, California, Kansas, or Alaska.
So, excuse me, so the health insurance, the fact that it's limited sometimes from state to state, kind of violates this.
It does. I want to ask, write down all your questions. I want to answer those at the end, but I want to get through all that. But yes, it's a very good point. And the third grab for federal power is the necessary and proper clause. If you go down to Article 1, Section 8, the very last line, it says...
Where are you? I'm sorry, where are you?
Article 1, Section 8.
I know.
Go to the very last line.
Oh, thank you.
To make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That's a very important point, because I've talked to local legislators, I've talked to local government officials, and they always say you can drive a Mack truck, which I don't know what that means, but through that necessary and proper clause. They say it's an open-ended discussion, but the problem is they have a very specific word that the founders used, says foregoing, the foregoing powers. That means all the powers, in order to execute all of these powers that are written above, they're allowed to make laws that are necessary for only the powers that are written above, not the powers that they come up with. So that's an important distinction of these three clauses. They do not give the federal government unlimited power to do what it wants. Because if it did, then why would we have this document in the first place, telling you exactly what they could do? That's the question that we want to ask. That's the question that we want answers to.
Wait, can I ask you something?
Let's write it down, and then we'll get to it at the end.
Okay, you got it.
So Article 1, Section 8, if you want to remember it real simply, tells you everything that Congress is allowed to legislate on. And very simply, Article 1, Section 9 is everything that Congress is specifically not allowed to do. So, Congress is not allowed to...
we're on 9.
We're on Section 9. And Congress is not allowed to remove or suspend the privilege of habeas corpus. That's a very important one. That means that they can't detain you without cause. And they can't do that unless, they say, unless there is a case of rebellion, invasion, or the public safety may require it. And so we have to make sure that we understand when the public safety is truly in danger, and that we hold the Congress accountable if it's not in danger and they're doing unreasonable detainments of individuals. The next thing they're not allowed to do is they're not allowed to tax or put a duty on any product. You know, a lot of people say that the sales tax, the federal sales tax, is the most fair tax. Well, according to the founders, they didn't think so. They said that the Congress is not allowed to put a tax on products or services crossing state lines at all. And what if it stays within the state? Well, then they can't touch it anyway, because that's intrastate commerce, not interstate commerce between the states. So far you have the Congress is not allowed to tax products that go across the state lines. They can't detain people. And then they can't put a duty on articles, no preference or regulations of commerce or revenue at the ports of certain states. They're not allowed to give preference to certain states' ports for passing commerce. So if a country wants to ship something to Florida, it has to have they can't promote Florida versus Maine or Arkansas, or I guess Arkansas doesn't have ports, Georgia or South Carolina. they can't promote one over the other. They have to give equal access to the ports all over the country.
That's only on law, it's not on logistics.
Right. Logistically, a company can decide, I want to go to Florida, and they can't say, no, you can't go to Florida, you have to go to Maine. So logistically, that's up to a company's discretion. And then you'll see that they're not allowed to draw on money from the Treasury without telling you exactly where it went. Go down. Go down.
Can't beat it, man.
Go down to two lines above where it says Section 10. It says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So you have to know, and you get to know, where every dollar is spent, every dollar that the Congress signs, and actually it has to wait for the President's signature to be able to go anywhere. That's a very important piece of legislation that is questionable right now, whether we know where all of our dollars have gone, and a number of people are questioning, who's getting the money. Finally, no titles of nobility can be taken. We don't have a king. We don't have lords. We don't have czars. We don't have any titles of nobility that can be given to any officers of the United States without the consent of Congress, and that's a very important thing because they left the king, who would give titles to everybody and would give them lands based on that, and we want to completely avoid that. Now, powers prohibited to the states is Article 1, Section 10. This one always gets me excited because I find that no one really knows about it. So Article 1, Section 9, sorry about that. Article 1, Section 10. No state can make treaties with other countries, which makes sense because the country is uniform in its commerce, so we don't want to make a treaty with Japan or Korea to get commerce that some of the other states wouldn't have access to. So very reasonable for the founders to think to do that. They made another point, though: no state can use anything but gold and silver for the payment of their debts. It's interesting that states weren't allowed to inflate the currency, just like the federal government wasn't allowed to inflate the currency, and they had to use the fixed standard of weight and measure, as proposed by Article 1, Section 8, to pay off their debts. So that way, states wouldn't be susceptible to times of inflation and deflation. I often wonder how much debt each of our states would be in if they had taken their revenue and put it in gold and silver to make it stable, because gold is not going up in value, the dollar is going down in value, and there's a distinction. So these are two interesting points. You'll see the other ones are relative to other things that they've already talked about in previous articles, and the states have some things that they're not allowed to do, which is important, and we'll note that in one of the amendments what else the states can't do or can do. Let's move on to the president. This won't take long. There's some things about how the president is elected, how the president is chosen, that we won't detail here. That's a discussion in and of itself. But I will say this, that if we followed that today, what the founders originally intended, I don't think that parties would be an issue in our country anymore. And you can read more details on that and ask the question why we moved from that and why parties wouldn't be an issue if elected. And I'll just tell you briefly, the person to get the most votes was the president, the person to get second most votes was the vice president, typically from two different parties, and that would have gridlock. And everybody's like, well, we don't want gridlock in Washington. I'm like, I don't want efficiency in Washington either, because if they're efficient at doing things that are bad to us, then we're in trouble. So the way that the president's elected is very important. How he, the oath that he takes is very important, and I'll touch on that at the very end. The president is doing very few things. The president shall receive just compensation. He gets paid for what he does. He